Do you know the sound of hope when it's forbidden? It's the faintest melody, barely a whisper beneath the static, trembling through battered wires as boots march past your door. In the dim hours before dawn, inside a factory barracks on the outskirts of Paris, Elias Novak sat hunched over a splintered workbench, his fingers coaxing life from a broken radio he'd salvaged weeks before. The world outside was all grey drizzle and shadows, but here in the hush between labour and sleep, something fragile flickered. An old song, a memory of freedom, and a letter folded so many times it was soft as cloth. He pressed the radio's backplate with a screwdriver, careful not to let the metal scrape too loudly. From beneath his cot, the letter waited. Its envelope was almost anonymous. No one wrote real names anymore, but in the curl of the CD at the bottom, he heard Clara's voice. Her words, though brief, pulsed with quiet courage. "Keep listening. I'll find you." Outside, the barracks door rattled. The clatter of German boots echoed through the corridor, routine patrol or maybe something more. Elias froze. Even the radio seemed to hold its breath. He was not supposed to be here. Not in France, not in this factory, not alive. The papers he carried named him a Polish mechanic, a displaced worker, but the truth, the name he'd been born with, the family he'd lost, the language that burned on his tongue, those were secrets he wore like scars, secrets that could get him killed. A ripple of static then, almost impossibly, a melody, thin and sweet, threaded through the crackle. He recognized it. La Vie en Rose. The Nazis had banned it months ago, but someone on the other side of the city must have risked everything to play it. Elias closed his eyes, letting the music settle over him like a benediction. The boots marched past. The door remained closed. He exhaled, shoulders trembling, and carefully wrapped the radio in a scrap of burlap. The first light crept through the blackout curtains, pale, uncertain, painting the barracks in washed-out blues. Around him, other men stirred on their cots. Polish, Czech, German, French. All carried the same ghostly fatigue, the same hunger in their eyes. The room smelled of oil, damp wool, and the metallic tang of fear. Elias tucked the letter into his shirt, close to his heart. He stood, joints aching from another sleepless night, and moved toward the battered basin to wash. The water was always cold. He scrubbed his hands, watching the grime spiral away, and caught his own reflection in the cracked mirror. Sharp cheekbones, deep-set eyes, the stubble of a beard. He looked older than 28. The siren sounded, a long, mournful note. Time for the morning shift. He joined the procession of workers filing out into the drab courtyard, shoulders hunched against the drizzle. The factory loomed ahead, a fortress of concrete and steel, its smokestacks rising like blackened fingers into the sky. Nazi banners hung limp from the windows, their colors bleeding in the rain. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter, rifles slung low, eyes scanning every face. Inside, the assembly lines clattered to life. Elias took his place among the machines, hands moving with mechanical precision, fastening bolts, inspecting shell casings, pretending not to notice the sabotage that sometimes crept into their work. Some men whispered in Polish, others in French. Most said nothing at all. At noon, a bell signaled the break. Elias slipped away from the noise, seeking the relative quiet of the factory schoolroom. It was a small, dusty space off the main corridor, lined with chipped desks and faded maps. Once, children had studied here. Now, it was a makeshift classroom for the workers' children, those few families who'd managed, somehow, to stay together. That's where he first saw her. Clara Dubois arrived with the rain, a stack of books pressed to her chest. She wore a blue wool coat, buttons mismatched, and a beret tilted just so. Her hair, dark and unruly, escaped in wisps around her face. Her eyes, clear and steady, swept the room with practiced ease, pausing for a split second on Elias. "Bonjour," she said, her voice warm but careful. "I've brought some reading." She set the books on a desk, arranging them with the gentle touch of someone who understood what stories could mean in a time like this. As she worked, her eyes flicked to the window, then to the door, then, again, to Elias. He felt a prickle of recognition. He'd seen her before, weaving through ration queues with a satchel of supplies, her laughter a bright thread in the gloom. Rumor said she was a teacher, a friend to everyone, But there was something else in the way she moved, a quiet urgency, a secret stitched beneath the surface. She caught him watching. "Do you read French?" she asked, her tone deliberately casual. "A little," Elias replied, tongue thick with accent. She smiled just enough to soften the room. "Perhaps you'll find something here to pass the time." She handed him a book, Le Petit Prince asterisk, its cover worn, pages flecked with age. Their fingers brushed, and for a moment the world narrowed to the space between them. "Merci," he said. Clara's gaze lingered. Not quite a question, not quite a warning. Then she turned, gathering her things. She moved toward the door, pausing only to adjust the curtain, letting in a slant of grey light. Outside, a German patrol passed, boots splashing through puddles. Clara waited until they'd gone before slipping out herself, vanishing into the rain. Elias opened the book. At first it seemed ordinary, a child's fable, a prince on a distant star. But tucked between the pages, near the middle, he found a scrap of paper. The words were written in a careful looping hand, asterisk tomorrow, 17H Boulangerie Saint-Pierre. Come alone. His heart hammered. He glanced up, but the room was empty. The rain beat harder against the glass. That night, he lay awake in his narrow cot, the letter from Clara pressed to his chest and the book hidden beneath his pillow. Every noise outside, the scrape of boots, the hiss of wind, was magnified by fear. What if it was a trap? What if Clara was not who she seemed? He remembered Warsaw, the betrayals, the cost of trust. But he also remembered the warmth in Clara's eyes, the way her fingers had lingered on his, the courage in her voice when she spoke to the children. He remembered the music, La Vie en Rose, and the promise it carried. He thought of the words she'd written, asterisk, come alone. He was tired of hiding, tired of surviving by halves, of living in a world where every kindness felt like treason. Outside, Paris held its breath. Street lamps glowed behind blackout curtains. The city was a patchwork of silence and sirens, of whispered rumors and sudden absences. People vanished overnight. Neighbors, friends, the man who sold bread on the corner, the girl who sang at the cafe. Resistance flyers appeared on lampposts, only to be torn down by soldiers hours later. In the metro, faces were pinched and wary, eyes flicking to uniforms, to armbands, to the shadows that gathered in every doorway. The next morning, Elias woke before dawn. The barracks was cold, the air sharp with the scent of wet stone and coal smoke. He dressed quickly, tucking Clara's book into his satchel and the letter into his shirt. He joined the line of workers shuffling toward the factory gates, head down, shoulders tight. On the street, bicycles rattled past. Women queued outside the butcher, ration books clutched in gloved hands. Children played hopscotch in the gutter, their laughter thin and uncertain. A German officer barked orders at a group of men unloading crates from a truck. The world was a study in contrasts. Ordinary life spliced with fear, small acts of defiance threaded through the fabric of survival. Elias kept to the edge of the crowd, moving with the flow of bodies toward the bakery. Boulangerie Saint-Pierre was a narrow shop, its windows fogged with steam. The scent of fresh bread drifted out, mingling with the damp air. He hesitated outside, heart pounding, then slipped through the door. Inside, the light was soft, golden and flickering, cast by a single candle on the counter. The shelves were mostly empty, save for a few loaves and a tray of stale pastries. A radio played quietly in the corner, the volume low enough to be mistaken for silence. Clara stood behind the counter, apron dusted with flour. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting with a smile that was all relief and something more, a kind of gratitude he could not quite name. "You came," she said, barely above a whisper. Elias nodded, hands trembling. They spoke in code, words layered with meaning. Clara asked about his work, his health, the weather. He replied with stories of broken machines and long hours, of rain that soaked through the roof and nights spent listening to the static. Between the lines, a message passed. Asterisk, we are not alone. We are still here. As the candle guttered, Clara pressed a paper bag into his hands. A loaf of bread still warm and another book, this one heavier, more worn. "Read this tonight," she said softly. "And if you have questions, come back, but be careful." Their eyes met, hers fierce and vulnerable, his searching, uncertain. For a moment, The war fell away, and they were only two people, reaching for something impossible in a world determined to keep them apart. Elias stepped into the rain, the bag pressed tight against his chest. He felt the weight of the book, the promise of another message hidden within. He turned back just once to see Clara watching from the window, her silhouette framed by flickering light. He knew then that he would go back, that he would risk everything, his safety, his secrets, his fragile hope, for the chance to see her again. In the dim glow of the barracks that night, Elias opened the second book. Another note slipped into his palm, the words trembling with urgency. Asterisk. Not all battles are fought with guns. Some we fight with our hearts. Promise me you'll come back, Elias. Promise me you'll survive. He pressed the note to his lips, eyes burning. Outside, the city was still. Inside, Elias made a silent vow, not just to endure but to live, to find Clara again and again, no matter the cost. He swore it. For her, he would survive. A week passed, each day heavy with the cadence of routine and the brittle crackle of fear. The world outside the factory's corrugated walls seemed to tighten its grip, as if the city itself was being slowly wound into silence by invisible hands. For Elias, time ticked in odd measures. The shriek of sirens at shift's end, the measured march of boots outside the dormitory, the furtive glance exchanged with a fellow worker when a name was called and no one answered. In this twilight existence, hope became an exercise in caution. A secret hymn hummed just loud enough to cling to, never so loud as to betray. Yet hope, once seeded, has a way of pushing through even the thickest gloom. The morning after Clara's note, Elias's resolve was as taut as the wire in his trembling hands. He rose early, slipping the coded slip, still pressed between the pages of Camus, into the pocket of his threadbare coat. He passed through the iron gates with the others, his face blank, his eyes lowered. The city's breath was cold and sharp, laced with the faintest scent of roasted chestnuts from a distant cart. German patrols moved in pairs, their helmets slick with rain, eyes scanning the lines of workers as if searching for a misplaced detail in an otherwise perfect arrangement. He reached the bakery just before sunrise. The sign above the door faded, but still legible. Boulangerie Saint-Denis. Inside, the air was thick with the perfume of flour and yeast, an almost unbearable reminder of ordinary life. Elias ordered a small loaf, the coins heavy in his palm, and waited. The bell above the door chimed once, and Clara entered with a basket on her arm, her hair tucked beneath a kerchief, her eyes tracing the room in a single sweep before settling on him. Their first meeting was wordless. She set a paper-wrapped bundle on the counter, nodded to the baker, then turned to Elias with the faintest of smiles. "For the school," she murmured, her accent soft, careful. In her eyes, he saw not only courage, but a question. One he answered by slipping the book she had given him onto the counter beside her basket. Their hands brushed in the exchange, a brief touch electric with meaning. Outside, the city was stirring, the streets awakening beneath a grey Parisian dawn. Elias trailed Clara at a distance, as if pulled by an invisible thread. She led him along narrow side streets, past shuttered cafes, and a once grand cinema now plastered with German posters. At a quiet intersection, she paused, waiting for him to catch up. "Did you read the note?" she asked, her voice barely above the hum of the city. He nodded. "I did." A hesitation. "You came." "I had to." There were no declarations, only the truth of presence, carved out in the margins of a world that had little use for sentiment. Clara smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing, if only for a moment. They walked together, trading small talk, weather, ration lines, the new headmaster at her school. Each word a test of trust, a step deeper into forbidden territory. That was how it began, with small risks, carefully measured. Their connection grew in the stolen minutes before curfew, in the brittle light that filtered through blackout curtains, in the coded messages slipped between the pages of borrowed books. Clara would bring texts to the factory schoolroom, Hugo, Zola, a battered copy of The Little Prince disguised as a primer, and within them, pressed like rare flowers, would be her thoughts, her warnings, and sometimes her hopes for tomorrow. Elias replied in kind, penning careful lines in pencil on scraps of paper, Fragments of poetry, memories of Warsaw before the sky turned to ash, the mundane details of grease and machinery as a way of reminding himself and her that he was still a man, not only a number or a shadow. Each letter was a lifeline, something to cling to when the night pressed in. Their meetings became a rhythm, a pulse beneath the city's occupation. Sometimes in the metro where the rattle and clatter masked their conversations, sometimes in a narrow park whose iron gates were always locked, but whose fence was low enough to slip through. Once in a candle-lit apartment above a shuttered flower shop, they sat close enough to hear each other's breath, the world outside reduced to the hush of distant sirens and the creak of old floorboards. It was in these moments, carved out from danger, that Elias learned the shape of Clara's courage. She spoke of her father, a railway worker, arrested the year before and never seen again. She told him of the first pamphlet she had helped print, and the fear that clung to her for days after. "Some nights," she confessed, "I think I hear their boots on my stairs, but I will not stop. If I do, it's as if they've already won." Elias, in turn, offered fragments of himself. He spoke of his mother's hands, the smell of cinnamon in their Warsaw kitchen, the last time he saw his brother before everything shattered. He kept the worst memories close, sharing only enough for Clara to understand the gravity of his silence. Their intimacy was not the stuff of fairy tales. There were no promises spoken beneath the moon, no grand vows. Instead, there was a steady, growing recognition. Two souls tethered by necessity, choosing each day to reach back toward each other. But the city was growing less forgiving. The first sign came as a rumor, whispered in the ration line, passed from hand to hand with the day's bread. A factory just across the river had been raided, half a dozen men taken for questioning, none returned. Then one night the dormitories were searched. Elias woke to torchlight and the harsh bark of German orders. He lay motionless as boots stomped past his bed, his heart hammering so loudly he was certain they would hear. Afterward everything felt changed. The workers moved more quietly, their eyes wary. The air in the factory was heavy with suspicion. Even the foreman, once indifferent, now watched the men like a hawk. Elias kept his head down, but he felt the net tightening. Clara, too, was changed. She arrived at their next meeting with her hair cropped short, a disguise, she explained, for a new assignment. Her hands shook as she passed him a folded page, the edges smudged with ink. "They're watching the trains," she whispered, "and the post. We must be more careful." Elias scanned the page, a list of names, times, a code he only half understood. "Is this—" "It's a warning." Her eyes, usually so steady, darted to the street. "Some of our friends are missing. You must not come to the bakery for a while. If you need to reach me, use the old bookstall near the river. Leave only a note." He wanted to protest, to demand she stay away from danger, but the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he nodded, memorizing the fear in her expression, committing it to memory as a kind of prayer. For days he saw Clara only in glimpses, her face in a passing tram, her figure vanishing around a corner. The lack of contact gnawed at him, each day stretching into the next until even the memory of her voice seemed to fray. He found himself replaying their last conversation, the warmth of her hand, the tremor in her words, the promise he made to survive for her. Life in the factory teetered on the edge of collapse. Tensions between workers and guards simmered, and rumors of sabotage ran like fever through the ranks. One evening, as Elias cleaned grease from his hands, a new face appeared in the dormitory, a man with a clipped accent and eyes that missed nothing. "Gestapo," someone whispered. The men fell silent, each retreating into himself. That night Elias dreamed of Warsaw. His father's voice, the clang of church bells, the taste of rain on stone. He woke to the sound of shouting, the dormitory doors wrenched open. A search, more brutal this time. Elias clutched his pillow, his mind racing. The book from Clara, still hidden beneath a loose floorboard, felt suddenly like a death sentence. Miraculously, they found nothing. But 3 men were taken anyway for questioning. The next morning their beds were made, their names scrubbed from the roster. Elias's world shrank to the space between breaths. He worked in silence, eyes fixed on the machines, hands moving with mechanical precision. He spoke to no one except in the rare moments when he dared to slip a note to the old bookseller by the river. Always the same message. "I am safe. I wait for your word." Sometimes there was an answer, a pressed flower, a line of poetry, Clara's familiar hand. These small tokens became his anchor, proof that she was still out there, still fighting, still believing in the possibility of after. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Elias emerged into the dusk to find Clara waiting for him in the shadow of a railway arch. She looked thinner, her eyes ringed with exhaustion, but when she smiled, the world seemed to tilt back into color. "I couldn't stay away," she whispered, her voice fierce, trembling with unshed tears. "They're closing in, Elias. I don't know how much longer I can—" He drew her close, the city's noise fading into a hush. "We will survive this," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I promised you." She pressed a slip of paper into his hand. "Promise me again. No matter what happens, you will live." Elias looked at her, saw the fear and the hope braided together in her gaze. "I swear it, Clara. For you, I will survive." It was not a grand vow, but a truth hammered out in the crucible of war. In that moment, their connection was more than words, a pact forged in the dark, a thread of light woven through the gathering storm. But even as hope flickered between them, the world outside grew more dangerous. The next morning, a new poster appeared at the gates, a list of names wanted for questioning. Elias scanned the list, his heart stuttering when he saw a name he recognized. Not his, but a friend's, a man who had once shared his bread. The Gestapo wasn't only hunting the resistance now. Any deviation, any hint of dissent was enough. Inside the factory, the mood was grim. Machinery broke down more frequently, sabotage suspected but never proven. The guards grew harsher, the food more meager. Elias learned to ration not only his bread but his words, his glances, even his hope. Clara, meanwhile, became more elusive. Sometimes weeks would pass without a sign. When she did appear, she brought news, coded, urgent. "They're moving prisoners through the city at night," she told him once, voice tight. "We must be ready. If the time comes, I'll leave a message with the baker's daughter. Watch for the red ribbon." Their meetings grew more dangerous, each one a risk calculated against the threat of discovery. Yet Elias clung to them, drawing strength from her presence, from the certainty that even in the darkness there was someone waiting for him. One grey afternoon, as rain lashed the cobblestones, Elias lingered at the bookstall, his hands trembling as he leafed through a volume of poetry. The bookseller coughed, a subtle warning, and Elias glanced up to see two men in black uniforms approaching. He forced himself to appear casual, heart pounding as the men questioned the vendor in clipped German. After a tense minute, they moved on, and the bookseller pressed a slip of paper into Elias's palm. He read it under the shelter of a bridge. "Keep faith. We are closer than ever." See, it was a small thing, a fragment of hope barely more than a breath. But it was enough. The city around them continued its slow spiral toward chaos. Bombs fell in the distance, shaking the windows of the dormitory. Trains carried more than goods now. The rumors spoke of whole families vanishing overnight. Elias watched as the lines at the ration depot grew longer, faces pinched with hunger and fear. Still he survived. For Clara, for the promise he had made. And for those listening now, drawn into the threads of this story, if you find yourself rooting for hope, even in the darkest of times, if you believe in the power of love to endure against all odds, I invite you to join us here to subscribe and become part of our community. Together we can keep these stories alive, holding on to the light, even when the world feels impossibly dark. Because sometimes it is the smallest promise, whispered in the shadows, that gives us the courage to survive another day. And so as Elias and Clara's world narrowed beneath the iron grip of war, their bond became both shield and beacon, a testament to the quiet, stubborn hope that endures even when freedom feels impossibly far away. Their story was far from over. The storm was only beginning to break. The factory bell tolled midnight, a hollow iron clang that shuddered through the bones of the barracks and sent the men in their bunks into fitful, anxious silence. Elias lay awake, eyes fixed on the seam where the damp ceiling met the wall, listening for the sound of boots that might stop outside his door. The rationed supper churned in his stomach, thin soup and stale bread. But hunger was an old companion. Tonight, it was the ache of waiting that gnawed at him most. He could not banish Clara's face from his mind, the warmth in her eyes the last time they met in the shadow of the bakery, her hand pressed briefly against his sleeve as she whispered, "Tomorrow. Rue des Ursulines. Dusk. Promise me." He had nodded, unable to find words, but in that moment an oath had settled in his chest with the weight of iron. He would survive for her, no matter what waited beyond the next checkpost, the next day's roll call. The hours dragged. From the corridor came a sudden scuffle, the bark of German voices. Elias's breath caught. He slid from his cot and knelt, heart jackhammering as the handle rattled. A false alarm, just the night watch, grumbling. He let out a slow, careful breath and pressed his palm to the folded letter beneath the mattress. Clara's looping script, the code only they understood. Each line a lifeline. He drifted in uneasy half-sleep, mind flickering through memories of Warsaw. His mother's hands kneading bread, the hush as his father tuned the family radio for forbidden broadcasts, and then the boots, the shouting, the endless trains. He could never shake the thought that he was living on borrowed time, every day a gift snatched from the jaws of fate. Dawn came, pale and damp. The siren called them to the floor. The factory was colder than usual, the windows fogged, the air thick with the tang of oil and fear. Word spread quickly. Gestapo trucks had been seen in the next arrondissement. Sabotage, someone whispered. A bomb on the railway line. The foreman's face was grey, his hands trembled as he doled out assignments. Elias's station was near the back wall, half hidden by crates of shell casings. He kept his head down, tools moving with steady precision as he watched the supervisor's pace, eyes sharp for any sign of weakness. He thought of Clara, her courage, the way she'd smuggled books under her coat, the coded maps she'd sketched in the margins of children's stories. He wondered if she was safe. By noon, the tension was suffocating. A German officer, his uniform immaculate, strode among the benches, barking questions in clipped French. Elias's French was good enough, but his accent was a little too careful, his papers a little too creased. When the officer paused beside him, he forced his hands to steady. "Name," the man demanded. "Elias Dubois," Elias lied, voice low. The officer stared, eyes boring into him, then moved on. Elias let out a silent, shaky sigh and bent lower over his work. That evening, the city lay under a heavy, unnatural quiet. The curfew bell had rung, but the streets were not yet empty, just quieter, as if even the wind was holding its breath. Elias slipped from the factory gates at dusk, coat collar pulled high, cap low over his brow. He walked in the gutter, avoiding the pools of lamplight, weaving through the warren of alleys and shuttered shops. The world was all shadows and the hush of distant footfalls. Rue des Ursulines was a narrow lane of crumbling stone facades and iron balconies. In the failing light, the bakery's window was dark, the sign askew. Elias waited beneath a torn awning, pulse thudding. He counted the seconds, everyone stretching into eternity. At last, Clara appeared from the far end of the street, her bicycle rattling softly over the cobbles. She wore a plain skirt, her hair tucked beneath a woolen beret, a satchel slung across her shoulder. She smiled, but her eyes were anxious. "You came," she breathed, voice trembling. "I was afraid." He reached for her hand, fingers cold and rough. "I promised." They ducked into the alley behind the bakery, pressed close beneath sagging laundry lines and the sharp scent of yeast. Clara looked at him, face pale in the twilight. "They're searching for a courier," she whispered. "A woman with dark hair seen near the station. They have a description, it could be anyone, but—" She bit her lip, glancing down at her satchel. "There's something I have to deliver. Tonight, if I'm stopped—" Elias's chest tightened. "Let me, I can—" "No." She squeezed his hand, fierce. "You can't risk it. They'll question you. Check your papers. If you're caught—" Her voice broke. I couldn't bear it. He wanted to argue, to beg her to stay hidden, but he saw the set of her jaw, the unyielding light in her eyes. She would go, with or without him. "Then let me come with you," he pleaded. "Two together are less suspicious. A couple out after curfew—" Clara hesitated, then nodded, quick and silent. Together they slipped through the maze of back streets, keeping to the darkest corners. The city felt different at night, emptier, more dangerous. Every sound was a threat. The distant bark of a dog, the echo of boots on stone, the mechanical whine of a patrol bicycle. At the edge of the marais, they paused in the lee of a shuttered café. Clara drew a slim volume from her bag, Baudelaire, the spine-worn. She opened it, revealing a photograph and a folded map hidden in the cut pages. "I have to leave this at a safe house," she whispered. "Rue de la Verrerie. After that, we wait for word." Elias nodded. He wanted to reach for her, to pull her close and tell her everything he'd never said. Instead, he pressed the book gently into her hands. "If anything happens," he began. She shook her head. "Don't. We'll see each other again. We have to." In the gloom, he saw her smile, fierce and shining. She brushed his cheek with her lips, soft as a promise. They moved quickly, weaving through silent streets, avoiding the main roads. The sky was heavy with low, bruised clouds. A siren wailed in the distance, a warning, or perhaps just the wind. The city felt suspended, as if holding its breath for what came next. Near the safe house, they froze. A pair of German soldiers stood beneath a street lamp, rifles slung, eyes scanning the darkness. Clara's hand found Elias's. He squeezed back, steadying her. A dog barked. The soldiers turned. Elias pulled Clara close, heart pounding. In that instant, he made a desperate choice. He stepped into the light, drawing their attention, speaking rapid, clumsy French. "Excusez-moi, monsieur, nous sommes perdus." The soldiers looked at them, suspicious. One gestured for their papers. Elias fumbled, forced a nervous laugh, handed over the forged documents. Clara pressed close, head bowed as if embarrassed. The soldiers scrutinized the papers, muttering. For one terrible moment, Elias was certain they would see through the ruse, that they would notice the trembling in his hands, the too new ink of the false stamps. But then, with a grunt, the soldier shoved the documents back. "Curfew is in 1 hour, go home." His eyes lingered on Clara, but he said nothing more. They hurried away, lungs burning, legs shaking. At the safe house, a second-floor apartment with blackout curtains and a battered door, Clara tucked the book into a hollow beneath the floorboards. The woman who answered the door was old, stooped, her eyes sharp and wary. She nodded, silent, and closed the door behind them. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Elias and Clara stood in the darkened stairwell, breathing hard, the weight of fear pressing down. Then Clara let out a shaky breath, half laugh, half sob. "We did it," she whispered. Elias took her hands, voice raw. "Promise me," he said, "that you'll be careful. Promise me you'll survive." She touched his face, gentle. "I promise. But you have to promise too. No matter what, survive. For me. For us." He nodded, the oath burning inside him. "I swear." They parted at the corner, Clara disappearing into the maze of night. Elias watched her go, every instinct screaming to follow, to protect her. But he knew. Her fight was as necessary as his survival. They were bound by something stronger than fear. 2 nights later, the factory was raided. It happened without warning. A crash of doors, shouts in German, searchlights slashing the gloom. Workers were herded into the yard, hands raised, faces white with terror. Elias's heart hammered as they called names, checked documents, dragged men away. He kept his head down, repeating his false name, praying the ink on his papers had not blurred. But then a soldier grabbed his arm, wrenching him from the line. "You! Papers!" Elias handed them over, sweat prickling his spine. The officer studied them, frowning. "Dubois? Like the courier?" he muttered in German. Elias didn't flinch. "It's a common name," he replied in French. The officer stared, then shoved him roughly toward the trucks. "We'll check, move." The world spun, shouts, boots, the stink of diesel. Elias was thrown into the back of a truck with a dozen other men. The doors slammed. Darkness. The engine roared to life. They jolted through the city, every bump a new terror. In the blackness, Elias clung to a single thought. Survive. For Clara. Hours later, they were herded into a makeshift holding cell. Concrete walls, a single bulb, guards at the door. The men huddled together, whispering prayers, names of loved ones. Elias sat alone, clutching the scrap of Clara's letter he'd managed to hide in his sleeve. The days blurred, interrogations, shouted questions, blows when answers came too slow. Elias gave nothing, revealed nothing. He thought of Clara's promise, the fire in her eyes, the vow he'd made. On the third night there was a commotion outside. Shouts, running footsteps, gunfire in the distance. The guards rushed from the room. For a moment there was silence. Then a key scraped in the lock. The door swung open. A man in civilian clothes slipped inside, breathless. "Novak," he whispered. Elias staggered to his feet. "Who?" "Clara sent me. The resistance. We're getting you out." The man pressed a pistol into Elias's shaking hand and led him down a back corridor, past empty offices, and out into the freezing night. Sirens wailed, searchlights flickered across the roofs. They ran, ducking behind rubble, dodging patrols. At last, in a narrow alley, the man turned to him. "Clara's waiting, at the apartment. Go, now." Elias ran, lungs burning, legs numb. He reached the candle-lit apartment, peeling wallpaper, the smell of rain in the air. Clara was there, standing in the half-light, eyes wet with relief. He fell into her arms, trembling. For a long moment, they just held each other, silent. Then Clara spoke, voice rough with tears. "I had to risk everything. I couldn't let them take you." Elias buried his face in her hair, the world falling away. "You saved me." "No," she whispered. "We saved each other. That's what love is. That's how we survive." Outside, the city groaned under the weight of occupation. But within those four walls, hope burned brighter than any candle. They had kept their promise. One forged in the darkness, lit by the smallest flame. And in that moment, Elias knew he would endure anything as long as she was beside him. That was the only victory that mattered. Dawn broke over Paris with a hush, the city caught between hope and exhaustion. In the shadowy streets, barricades of silence lingered, even as the world outside slowly began to stir. The last of the German patrols had vanished from the boulevards, replaced by an unfamiliar quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. On this morning, liberation was more rumor than reality. A word whispered in the marketplace, a cautious smile exchanged in the stairwell. But for Elias Novak, hunched by the window in Clara's candle-lit apartment, it was the first day in years he dared to imagine a future. He had survived the night. The promise he made to Clara, "Promise me, Elias, promise me you'll survive," echoed in every heartbeat as he watched the world outside return to color. Below, in the narrow street, neighbors emerged from hiding. Old women in faded scarves swept their stoops. A boy balanced on the pedals of a battered bicycle, laughing as if he remembered how. And from somewhere the scent of baking bread drifted upward, impossibly sweet after so many months of rations and fear. Elias pressed his palm to the glass, feeling the cool morning bleed through his skin. He had not slept, not really. All night he replayed the final moments, the desperate scramble through back alleys, Clara's hand in his, the coded message tucked inside her coat. The city had trembled with gunfire and the distant echo of armored trucks, but they had moved like shadows, guided by memory and hope. For months they had lived like this, each day a borrowed fragment, each night a question. Now the silence felt different. Heavy, yes, but not with dread. This was the weight of possibility. A soft rustle behind him. Clara stood in the doorway, her hair tangled from sleep, eyes rimmed with exhaustion and something brighter, relief perhaps, or the fragile beginnings of joy. She crossed the room, her footsteps careful on the warped floorboards, and settled beside him. For a long while neither spoke. The world beyond the window was enough. When Clara finally broke the silence, her voice was raw with emotion. "It's over, Elias. The Germans are gone." He turned to her, searching her face for confirmation, for anything beyond hope. "Are you certain?" She nodded. "I saw the flags from the metro station. People are gathering in the square. They're singing, Elias. They're singing our songs again." A memory flickered in his chest, the forbidden melody that once drifted through static in the barracks, the song of his childhood. For so long music had been a secret rebellion, a lifeline to something lost. Now it belonged to everyone again. He reached for Clara's hand, holding it as if to anchor himself to this moment. Her fingers, calloused from years of chalk and clandestine messages, curled around his own. "It feels unreal," he whispered. "We survived." Her grip tightened. Because you promised me. Because we both refused to let go. They sat in silence, letting the truth settle between them. The promise that had carried them through darkness was no longer a shield, it was a doorway. Outside, the city was waking, and with it, the world they had fought for. By midday, Paris was transformed. The grey hush of occupation gave way to shouts and laughter, to the thunder of footsteps on cobblestones, as people poured into the streets. Resistance ribbons bloomed like wildflowers on lapels. Tricolour flags waved from windows. The air itself seemed lighter, threaded with possibility. Elias and Clara stepped into the sunlight together, blinking at the sudden brightness. For the first time, they walked side by side without fear of patrols or checkpoints. Clara tucked her arm through his, her chin lifted, her eyes shining. She wore her old summer dress, faded but defiant, and a jacket too large for her frame, a gift from Elias, traded for a week's worth of ration coupons in the depths of winter. They moved through the crowd, greeted by neighbors who only now dared to smile. The baker's wife pressed a crust of bread into Elias's hands, her own trembling with emotion. "For luck," she whispered, before vanishing into the throng. At the edge of the square, a group had gathered around a battered piano hauled from some cellar. Someone struck a chord, and suddenly the entire square erupted in song. The melody was familiar, an anthem of hope and defiance, banned for years but never forgotten. Elias felt the music bloom inside him, filling spaces he'd thought were lost forever. He glanced at Clara, who was singing with tears on her cheeks, her voice clear and true. He joined her, letting the music carry them both. Around them, strangers became friends, united by the simple act of surviving, of believing in tomorrow. That afternoon, as the city celebrated, Elias and Clara slipped away to the banks of the Seine. They found a quiet spot beneath a willow tree, the world muffled by the river's slow current and the rustle of leaves overhead. Here the noise of liberation faded, leaving only the quiet intimacy they had carved out in stolen moments. Elias traced circles in the dust with his thumb, searching for words that might bridge the distance between past and future. "I don't know how to live without fear," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I've forgotten what it means to make plans, to dream." Clara shifted closer, her gaze steady and unwavering. "We'll learn together, one day at a time." He looked at her, truly looked, the curve of her jaw, the light in her eyes, the way she held herself with a quiet strength that had seen them through impossible nights. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what might come next. A life beyond secrets and coded notes, beyond ration lines and whispered goodbyes. "Do you remember the promise?" he asked. She smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I do. You promised you would survive for me." He reached into his jacket, pulling from the inner pocket the letter she had given him on the night everything changed. The paper was soft, the ink faded, but her words remained. He read them aloud, his voice trembling with gratitude and relief. "Keep listening. I'll find you." Clara pressed her forehead to his, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You found me, Elias. We found each other." He kissed her, gentle and reverent, as if sealing the promise forever. In the weeks that followed, Paris rebuilt itself with a ferocious tenderness. Streets once patrolled by soldiers now teemed with children's laughter. Shopkeepers dusted off old signs. Lovers held hands in the open. The wounds of war remained. Empty chairs at dinner tables, scars hidden beneath sleeves. But hope was no longer forbidden. Elias and Clara found work together at a school on the outskirts of the city. She taught by day, her lessons threaded with stories of courage and resilience. He repaired what was broken, desks, shutters, sometimes hearts. Their love, once a secret lifeline, became a quiet certainty. They moved through the world as partners, no longer haunted by the fear of discovery. But the past was never far. Letters arrived from friends lost to the camps, fragments of lives scattered by war. At night, Elias sometimes woke to the echo of boots in the corridor, the phantom ache of a promise almost broken. Clara would hold him until the tremors passed, her presence a balm against the darkness. They spoke often of what had kept them alive, not just the promise but the tiny acts of kindness, the courage to choose hope even when it seemed impossible. Clara's work with the resistance had forged a network of unlikely allies, people who risked everything for the dream of a better world. Elias had learned to trust, to reach beyond his fear, to believe that love could endure even the longest night. In time, they married in a small ceremony, surrounded by friends who understood the true cost of survival. There was no grand celebration, only a quiet gathering in the candle-lit apartment where it had all begun. The vows were simple, spoken in the language of survivors. I will not let go, I will remember. I will love you even when the world is unkind. Years later, as the city healed and scars faded into memory, Elias often found himself returning to that first promise. He would sit by the window in the early morning, watching the world awaken, and remember the sound of hope. Fragile, trembling, persistent. He knew that survival was not a single act, but a series of choices. Every day he chose to build something new from the ruins. Every day he honored the promise that had carried him through. He and Clara grew older together, their love deepening with every shared sunrise. They kept the old radio, now repaired and gleaming, on the mantel above their fireplace. On quiet evenings, they would sit together, listening to the songs that had once been forbidden, letting the music fill their home with gratitude. Sometimes Elias would find the faded letter tucked between the pages of a book, Clara's handwriting a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope can find you if you keep listening. If there's one thing you take from their story, let it be this. Love is not just a refuge in the storm, but the promise that guides you through it. Even when the world seems lost, even when fear is all you know, hold fast to the people who give you hope. Make your promise and keep it. And now, if this story moved you, if you felt the weight of Elias and Clara's journey, the courage it took to survive and love despite everything, please let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts, your own stories of hope, or simply the names of those you wish to remember. If you want to hear more true-to-life stories of resilience and love, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Your support means the world to us and helps keep these memories alive. Thank you for listening. And wherever you are, may you always keep listening for hope.